The morning mist clung to the Arkansas Valley like a ghostly shroud as Sarah McKenna stepped carefully through the tall grass, her worn leather boots making barely a whisper against the dew-soaked earth. She carried a wooden bucket in one hand and a small hunting knife in the other, both tools essential for her daily routine of gathering wild herbs and roots for the Whitmore household where she worked as a servant. Sarah had been walking this same path for 3 years now, ever since she'd fled the overcrowded tenements of New York City, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning desire to escape the suffocating poverty that had claimed her parents. The Whitmore family had taken her in when she arrived in Arkansas Territory, exhausted and nearly starved, offering her work in exchange for a small room in their attic and 2 meals a day. At 22, Sarah had learned to find contentment in simple things: the way morning light filtered through the pine trees, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the quiet moments before the household stirred to life. She had grown strong from her outdoor work, her once pale hands now bronzed from the sun, her slight frame filled out with muscle earned through honest labor. This particular morning felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. She had risen earlier than usual, driven by a restlessness she couldn't name. The Whitmores were still asleep in their comfortable beds, unaware that their quiet servant girl was already miles from the house, following a deer trail that wound deeper into the wilderness than she had ever ventured before. The sound reached her first, a low, pained groan that seemed to drift on the morning breeze. Sarah froze, her hand tightening on the knife handle. Wild animals were common in these parts, and she had no desire to stumble upon an injured bear or mountain cat. But as she listened more carefully, she realized the sound was distinctly human. Moving as quietly as she could, Sarah followed the groaning to its source. What she found made her stomach lurch with shock and sympathy. 2 men lay crumpled near a fallen log, their clothes torn and bloodied, their faces painted with the traditional markings she recognized as Choctaw. One appeared to be in his 30s, tall and lean with long black hair now matted with blood from a gash across his forehead. The other was younger, perhaps her own age, his left shoulder clearly dislocated and his breathing shallow and labored. Sarah's first instinct was to run. The Whitmores, like most white settlers in the territory, viewed the native tribes with suspicion and fear. Stories circulated constantly about raids and kidnappings, though Sarah had never witnessed such violence herself. But as she looked at these 2 broken men, she saw only fellow human beings in desperate need of help. The older man's eyes fluttered open as she approached, and for a moment they stared at each other in mutual wariness. He tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent fresh blood trickling down his face. His hand moved instinctively toward what Sarah now realized was an empty knife sheath at his belt. "Peace," Sarah said softly, raising her empty hand while keeping the knife low and non-threatening. "I want to help." The man's dark eyes searched her face, perhaps surprised by the genuine concern he found there. He spoke something in his native language to his companion, who had also awakened and was regarding Sarah with obvious suspicion, despite his weakened state. Sarah set down her bucket and pulled out the clean cloth she always carried for wrapping herbs. Without waiting for permission, she knelt beside the older man and gently pressed the fabric against his head wound. He tensed but didn't pull away, watching her every movement with the alertness of a wild animal ready to bolt. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly, continuing to tend his wound with practiced efficiency. Years of caring for injured farm animals had taught her the basics of treating cuts and breaks. The man was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his English was careful but clear. "We were scouting for our people. White men found us at dawn." "They had guns!" Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. "How many?" 5, maybe 6. "They took our horses, our weapons." His jaw clenched with what might have been shame or anger. "We fought, but you're alive," Sarah interrupted firmly. "That's what matters now." She turned her attention to the younger man who had been listening to their exchange with growing confusion. She could see that his shoulder was badly dislocated, the joint sitting at an unnatural angle that must have been causing him considerable pain. "I need to fix his shoulder," she told the older scout. "It will hurt, but if we leave it like this, he may never use that arm properly again." The 2 men exchanged words in Choctaw, their voices tense with debate. Finally, the older man nodded grimly. "Do what you must." Sarah had seen the veterinarian in town relocate a horse's shoulder once, and she hoped the principle was the same. She positioned herself carefully, placed her hands on the younger man's arm and shoulder, and counted to 3 before applying sudden, firm pressure. The scout's cry of pain echoed through the morning air, followed immediately by the distinctive pop of the joint sliding back into place. He sagged with relief, his breathing becoming immediately easier. "Better?" Sarah asked and received a weak nod in response. She used strips torn from her own petticoat to fashion a crude sling, then turned back to check the older man's head wound. The bleeding had slowed, and while he would need proper stitching, it wasn't immediately life-threatening. "You need to get somewhere safe," she told them both. "Those men might come back." The older scout studied her face again with that same intense scrutiny. "Why do you help us?" "Your people and mine. We are not friends." Sarah considered the question seriously. "Because you're hurt and I can help." "Isn't that reason enough?" Something shifted in the man's expression, a guardedness giving way to something that might have been respect. "What is your name?" "Sarah McKenna. I am Joseph Crowfeather. This is my nephew, David." He gestured to the younger man, who was already looking stronger with his shoulder properly positioned. "Can you walk?" Sarah asked. "I know a place you can rest safely while you heal." She was thinking of an abandoned trapper's cabin she had discovered weeks ago during one of her herb-gathering expeditions. It was well hidden and stocked with basic supplies left behind by its former occupant. Joseph tested his legs, grimacing as he stood but managing to stay upright. David needed more help, but with his uncle's support, he too could manage to walk short distances. As they began their slow journey toward the hidden cabin, Sarah found herself glancing back toward the Whitmore house, knowing she would return to find her absence noticed and her daily chores undone. Mrs. Whitmore would be displeased, and there would likely be consequences for her unexplained disappearance. But as she looked at the 2 wounded men struggling along beside her, their quiet dignity intact despite their circumstances, Sarah knew she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. Something told her this morning's events would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The abandoned trapper's cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees, its log walls weathered gray by countless seasons, but still sound enough to provide shelter. Sarah had discovered it 3 weeks earlier, while following a particularly promising patch of wild ginseng, and she had been grateful for the refuge during a sudden thunderstorm that day. Now, as she helped Joseph and David make their way up the barely visible path to the cabin's door, she was even more thankful for her earlier discovery. The structure was small but well built, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and 2 narrow bunks that would serve their current needs perfectly. "This will do," Joseph said quietly as Sarah pushed open the door and ushered them inside. He moved to one of the small windows and peered out through the grimy glass, his trained eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. David collapsed onto one of the bunks with obvious relief, his face pale from the effort of walking even this short distance. The makeshift sling Sarah had created was already showing spots of blood where his shoulder wound had reopened during their journey. Sarah quickly set about making the cabin as comfortable as possible. She used her flint to start a small fire in the fireplace, then filled a dented pot she found hanging on a wall peg with water from her bucket. While the water heated, she examined the cabin's supplies more thoroughly than she had during her first visit. The previous occupant had left behind several useful items, a collection of metal cups and plates, some basic cooking implements, a few tattered blankets, and most importantly, a small wooden chest containing various medicines and bandaging materials. Sarah recognized several of the bottles as containing the same herbal tinctures and poultices her mother had used back in New York when neighbors came seeking help for their ailments. "Your shoulder needs proper cleaning," she told David, who nodded wearily. Joseph translated her words. Though Sarah suspected the younger man understood more English than he let on, she worked carefully, using the warm water and a clean cloth to wash away the dried blood and dirt from both men's wounds. Joseph submitted to her ministrations with stoic patience, though she could see him tense whenever she touched the deeper parts of his head wound. David was less successful at hiding his discomfort, occasionally letting out small gasps when she had to probe around his injured shoulder. "You have done this before," Joseph observed as Sarah expertly applied a poultice made from herbs she had gathered that morning, mixed with supplies from the medicine chest. "My mother was a healer of sorts," Sarah explained, her hands never pausing in their work. "People in our neighborhood came to her when they couldn't afford a real doctor. She taught me what she knew before she died." "And your father?" "Gone before her. Fever took them both when I was 19. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, the pain of those memories having dulled to a manageable ache over the years. Joseph was quiet for a moment, considering this information. So you are alone in this world. I have work. I have a place to sleep and food to eat. That's more than many can say, but no family, no husband to protect you. Sarah's hand stilled briefly as she secured the bandage around his head. I protect myself well enough. There was something in her tone that made Joseph look at her more carefully. She was not the typical white woman he had encountered in his dealings with settlers. Most were either terrified of his people or filled with the kind of righteous anger that led to violence. This one showed neither fear nor hatred, only a practical concern for their immediate needs. David spoke something in Choctaw, his voice weak but urgent. Joseph listened, then turned back to Sarah. He asks if you will be punished for helping us, if your people will be angry when they discover you are gone. Sarah finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels. She had been trying not to think about the inevitable reckoning awaiting her back at the Whitmore house. Mrs. Whitmore expected her servants to be available at all times, and unexplained absences were met with reduced meals, extra work, or sometimes the threat of dismissal. Probably, she admitted, but that's my concern, not yours. You risk much for strangers. You're not strangers anymore. Sarah began repacking the medical supplies, her movements efficient and sure. You're Joseph and David, and you're hurt, and I can help. Everything else is just complications. Joseph studied her with growing fascination. In his 34 years, he had encountered many white settlers, and most had been predictable in their reactions to his presence. Fear, anger, greed, suspicion. These were the emotions he had come to expect. But this young woman seemed to operate by a different set of rules entirely. The men who attacked you, Sarah said, changing the subject as she prepared a meal from the cabin's meager supplies. Do you think they'll come looking for you here? No, they think we are dead. Joseph's expression darkened. They left us for the vultures and went to join a larger group heading toward the Cherokee lands. Cherokee? Sarah looked up from the fire where she was heating a can of beans. But this is Choctaw territory. Not anymore. Your government has decided we must move west, all of us. Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole. His voice carried a bitterness that made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. They call it the Indian Removal Act. Sarah had heard whispers of such policies in town, but she had not paid much attention to political matters. Her concerns were more immediate: where her next meal would come from, whether the Whitmores would keep her on through the winter, how to repair her only decent dress when it finally wore through completely. Where will you go? She asked quietly. Oklahoma Territory. If we survive the journey. Joseph accepted the plate of beans and hard bread she offered him. Many will not. The old ones, the children, the sick, they are not strong enough for such a trip. David spoke again, his voice stronger now after rest and treatment. Joseph listened, then smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen from him. He says to tell you that you have gentle hands and a kind heart, that the spirits must have sent you to help us. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Tell him he's welcome. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackling fire and the soft sounds of the forest providing a peaceful backdrop to their meal. Sarah found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companions, noting the way they held themselves with quiet dignity despite their circumstances, the careful respect they showed each other and her. As evening approached, Sarah knew she could delay her return no longer. The Whitmores would already be furious about her absence, and every additional hour would only make her situation worse. I have to go. Back, she said reluctantly as she gathered her empty bucket and remaining supplies. It is not safe for you to travel alone in the dark, Joseph protested. I know these woods well enough, and I can't stay away any longer without making things worse for myself. Joseph stood and moved to the window again, scanning the darkening forest. The men who heard us, they were heading north toward the main settlement. If they see you, they have no reason to bother with a servant girl, Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. I'll be careful. David said something urgent in Choctaw, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face. Joseph nodded thoughtfully. He says you should not come back, that you have done enough, and we will manage from here. Sarah paused in her preparations, struck by an unexpected pang at the thought of never seeing these two men again. Will you? Manage, I mean. We are Choctaw. We endure. That's not what I asked. Joseph's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. David's shoulder will heal in time. My head is hard enough to survive a worse blow than this. We will rest here for a few days, then continue to our people. Sarah nodded, though something in her chest felt tight and uncomfortable. There's more food in that chest and clean water from the stream behind the cabin. The blankets should keep you warm enough. Sarah McKenna. Joseph's use of her full name made her look up at him. You have saved our lives this day. We will not forget. I hope you find your people safely, she replied simply. But as Sarah made her way through the darkening forest toward the Whitmore house and whatever punishment awaited her there, she couldn't shake the feeling that her own story was just beginning, and that the two Choctaw scouts would somehow be part of whatever came next. Sarah's punishment for her unexplained absence was swift and harsh. Mrs. Whitmore met her at the kitchen door with a face like thunder, her pale blue eyes blazing with indignation at having to prepare her own breakfast and tend to her own needs for an entire day. Where have you been, you foolish girl? The woman demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I've had to do everything myself while you've been off gallivanting through the wilderness like some wild creature. I was gathering herbs, ma'am, Sarah replied quietly, keeping her eyes downcast as she had learned to do when Mrs. Whitmore was in one of her moods. I got lost and had to wait for daylight to find my way back. Lost. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose to a near shriek. You've been walking these woods for 3 years and suddenly you're lost? Do you take me for a complete fool? Sarah remained silent, knowing that any response would only fuel the woman's anger. Behind Mrs. Whitmore, she could see Mr. Whitmore hovering in the doorway, his expression uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene in his wife's discipline of the household staff. You'll work without meals for the next 3 days, Mrs. Whitmore declared, and you'll sleep in the barn until I decide you've learned your lesson about responsibility and obedience. Sarah nodded acceptance of the punishment, though her stomach was already cramping with hunger after her long day in the forest. 3 days without food would be difficult, but she had endured worse privations in her life. As she went about her evening chores, cleaning the kitchen, banking the fires, preparing clothes for washing, Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin and the 2 wounded men she had left there. Were they managing to keep warm? Had Joseph's head wound reopened? Was David's shoulder healing properly? The questions plagued her through the long, cold night in the barn, where she curled up in the hay with only her thin shawl for warmth. Even when exhaustion finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with images of dark eyes and blood-stained bandages. The next morning brought no relief from her worries. As Sarah went about her duties on an empty stomach, she found herself making small preparations for another trip to the cabin. She secreted away bits of bread and dried meat when Mrs. Whitmore wasn't looking, refilled her water bottle, and gathered additional medical supplies from the household stores. By evening, she had convinced herself that she needed to check on the wounded men just once more, if only to ensure they were healing properly. The fact that her heart raced with anticipation at the thought of seeing them again was something she chose not to examine too closely. This time, Sarah waited until well after midnight before slipping out of the barn. The moon was bright enough to light her way through the familiar forest paths, and she made good time to the hidden cabin. As she approached, she was relieved to see a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, indicating that Joseph and David were not only still there, but well enough to maintain a fire. Joseph met her at the door before she could knock, as if he had sensed her approach. His head wound was obviously healing well. The bandage was clean and properly tied, and his eyes were clear and alert. You should not have come, he said quietly, though his tone suggested he was pleased to see her despite his words. I brought food and fresh bandages, Sarah replied, holding up her small bundle of supplies. How is David? See for yourself. David was sitting up on his bunk, his color much improved and his wounded shoulder held in a more natural position. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up with a genuine smile that transformed his serious features into something almost boyish. Much better, he said in careful English, and Sarah realized he had understood far more of their previous conversations than she had suspected. Your English is very good, she said as she unpacked the food she had brought. Joseph, teach me. Say it important to understand the white man's words. Joseph nodded seriously. Knowledge of your language has saved our lives more than once. We hear things that are not meant for our ears. Like what? The 2 men exchanged a look before Joseph answered. The men who attacked us, they were not acting alone. They were part of a larger group planning to ambush our people as we prepare for the removal. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How many people? Our entire band. Nearly 200 souls. Joseph's voice was heavy with concern. Men, women, children, elders. They trust the government promises that they will be protected on the journey west. But they won't be. There are men who profit from our removal. Some want our lands for themselves. Others sell supplies to the government at inflated prices and provide poor quality goods. Still others, Joseph's jaw tightened. Still others simply enjoy the killing. Sarah sank onto the rough wooden chair beside the table, her mind reeling with the implications. You have to warn your people. We will. When we are strong enough to travel. David's hand moved to his shoulder, testing its range of motion. Perhaps tomorrow or the day after. That might be too late, Sarah said urgently. If you know when this attack is planned. We know, Joseph said grimly. 3 days hence, when our people gather at the crossing point to begin the journey. The attackers plan to strike at dawn when the camp is preparing to move. 3 days. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Joseph was clearly healing well, but David's shoulder would limit his mobility. Even if they could travel, could they reach their people in time to make a difference? How far is your camp from here? She asked. 2 days hard travel on foot. Less on horseback, but we have no horses. I could go. The words were out of Sarah's mouth before she had fully considered them. Both men stared at her in astonishment. You? Joseph's voice was carefully neutral. You would warn people you do not know about danger you have no part in. Those people don't deserve to die because some men are greedy or evil, Sarah replied firmly. If I can help prevent it, then I should. It is too dangerous, David protested. If the bad men see you, they won't. I know these woods better than any white man, and I can move faster alone than you can with your injuries. Joseph studied her face with that intense scrutiny she was beginning to recognize. Why would you do this? Your own people would consider you a traitor for warning us. Sarah considered the question seriously. Why was she willing to risk everything for people she had never met? The answer, when it came to her, was surprisingly simple. Because it's right. Because those people have children and grandparents and hopes for the future, just like anyone else. Because... She paused, struggling to put her feelings into words. Because you trusted me enough to let me help you, and now I know that everything I've been told about your people is wrong. And if you are caught? If your own people discover what you have done? Sarah thought about Mrs. Whitmore's anger over a single day's absence, about the comfortable but constrained life she led as a servant, about the endless cycle of other people's demands and expectations that had defined her existence for so long. Then I'll face whatever comes, she said, simply. Joseph and David spoke, rapidly in Choctaw for several minutes, their voices low but urgent. Finally, Joseph turned back to Sarah. If you truly mean to do this thing, you must understand the danger. The men who attacked us will likely be watching the approaches to our camp. They will not hesitate to kill anyone who interferes with their plans. I understand. And if you succeed in warning our people, if the attack is prevented, your own life here will become impossible. Word will spread that a white woman helped the Choctaw. There will be those who will want revenge. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the full implications of her offer became clear. She would not be able to return to the Whitmore house, to her simple but secure life as a servant. Everything she had built for herself in Arkansas Territory would be lost. But as she looked at David's earnest face and Joseph's solemn eyes, she knew she had already made her choice. Tell me how to find your people, she said quietly, and tell me what I need to say to convince them that the warning is real. Joseph reached out and placed his hand over hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Sarah McKenna, he said formally. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Crowfeather clan. No harm will come to you while we draw breath. David nodded solemnly and repeated the same words in Choctaw, the foreign syllables somehow carrying more weight than any English promise she had ever heard. As Sarah prepared to leave on what might be the most important and dangerous journey of her life, she realized that for the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Sarah left the cabin before dawn, carrying nothing but a small pack with water, a bit of food, and the detailed directions Joseph had given her to find the Choctaw encampment. She moved through the forest like a ghost, using every skill she had learned during her years of herb gathering to avoid leaving tracks or making noise that might alert potential enemies to her presence. The journey was more difficult than she had anticipated. Joseph's directions were precise, but the terrain was rough and unfamiliar once she moved beyond her usual gathering grounds. She had to cross 2 swift-running streams, navigate around a treacherous bog that could have swallowed her whole, and climb through a rocky pass that left her hands cut and bleeding. By midday, Sarah was exhausted and beginning to doubt her ability to complete the mission. Her legs shook with fatigue, her empty stomach cramped with hunger, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. But each time she considered turning back, she thought of David's earnest face and Joseph's solemn promise of protection, and she forced herself to continue. It was late afternoon when she first caught sight of smoke rising in the distance. Her heart pounded with a mixture of relief and terror as she realized she was approaching the Choctaw camp. Everything depended on the next few hours, whether she could convince these people to trust her warning, whether she could help them avoid the massacre planned for dawn. Sarah approached the camp carefully, remembering Joseph's instructions about how to make herself known without being shot as an intruder. She stopped at the edge of the tree line and called out in the few Choctaw words he had taught her, announcing her peaceful intentions and asking for safe passage. The response was immediate. 3 warriors emerged from concealment with weapons drawn, their faces grim and suspicious. They spoke rapidly among themselves in their native language, clearly debating what to do with this unexpected white visitor. "I need to speak with your chief," Sarah said clearly, keeping her hands visible and her voice steady despite her fear. "I bring warning from Joseph Crowfeather and his nephew David." At the mention of those names, the warriors' expressions shifted from suspicion to surprise. One of them, a man about Joseph's age with intricate tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. "You know Joseph Crowfeather?" he asked in accented but clear English. "He and David are wounded but alive. They sent me to warn you about an attack planned for tomorrow morning." The tattooed warrior studied her face intently, then spoke to his companions in rapid Choctaw. After a brief discussion, he gestured for Sarah to follow him into the camp. The sight that greeted her took Sarah's breath away. The encampment stretched along the banks of a wide stream, filled with dozens of temporary shelters and cooking fires. Everywhere she looked, she saw families preparing for their forced journey west, packing belongings, tending to children, caring for elderly relatives who looked too frail to survive such a trek. The reality of what was about to happen to these people hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't the savage warriors she had heard described in the settlements. They were families, communities, people whose lives were being torn apart by forces beyond their control. The warrior led her to a large tent at the center of the camp, where an elderly man with silver-streaked hair and deeply lined face sat in council with several other tribal leaders. The discussion stopped abruptly when Sarah appeared, and she felt the weight of their collective gaze as the warrior explained her presence, though elderly chief, for Sarah could see by the deference others showed him that this was their leader, listened carefully to the warrior's report. Then he turned his attention to Sarah, his dark eyes seeming to see straight through to her soul. "I am Chief Gray Bear," he said formally. "You claim to bring word from my scouts Joseph and David. Speak, and tell me how a white woman comes to know the fate of my men." Sarah took a deep breath and began her story, starting with finding the wounded scouts and ending with Joseph's urgent warning about the planned attack. She spoke clearly and honestly, leaving out nothing that might help convince them of the danger they faced. When she finished, the tent was silent except for the soft sounds of the camp beyond the canvas walls. The tribal leaders exchanged meaningful looks, and Sarah could practically feel them weighing her words against their knowledge of the situation. "The attack is planned for dawn?" Chief Gray Bear asked finally. "Yes. Joseph said the men planned to strike when you were preparing to move, when everyone would be focused on breaking camp rather than watching for enemies." One of the other leaders, a younger man with warrior scars across his chest, spoke up. "This could be a trap. How do we know she speaks truth? How do we know she is not sent by our enemies to confuse us?" Sarah felt her heart sink as murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled leaders. She had anticipated suspicion, but she had hoped that Joseph's name would be enough to earn their trust. "Joseph gave me this," she said quietly, pulling a small carved bone pendant from her pocket. It was something Joseph had pressed into her hand just before she left the cabin, telling her it would prove she spoke for him. Chief Gray Bear's eyes widened when he saw the pendant, and he reached out to take it with reverent hands. He examined it carefully, running his fingers over the intricate carvings before passing it to the other leaders. "This is the sacred amulet of the Crowfeather clan," he said slowly. "Joseph would not give this to an enemy. If he trusted this woman with such a treasure, then we must trust her words." The mood in the tent shifted palpably as the leaders accepted the validity of Sarah's warning. The discussion that followed was rapid and intense, conducted entirely in Choctaw, but Sarah could sense the urgency as they debated their options. Finally, Chief Gray Bear turned back to her. "We believe your warning, Sarah McKenna, but changing our plans now will not be simple. Our people have prepared for this journey for months. To tell them now that we must scatter and hide instead. What if you could turn the trap against the trappers?" Sarah asked suddenly, an idea forming in her mind. "Joseph said there are nearly 200 people in your band. That's more than enough to outnumber the attackers if you're ready for them." The scarred warrior leaned forward with interest. "You suggest we fight? I suggest you be prepared. If they're planning to attack at dawn while you're breaking camp, then don't break camp. Be ready for them instead." Chief Gray Bear smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the tent, and she caught a glimpse of the formidable leader he must have been in his younger days. A clever thought. But there are women and children to consider. Elders who cannot fight, then move them tonight. Send them somewhere safe while your warriors prepare the trap. The discussion that followed was longer and more complex, with various leaders offering suggestions and raising concerns. Sarah found herself drawn into the planning, her knowledge of the local terrain proving valuable as they debated the best places to position their fighters and hide their vulnerable members. As the sun set and the council continued, Sarah realized she was experiencing something unprecedented in her life. These people were treating her not as a servant or an outsider, but as a valued member of their community whose opinions mattered. The contrast with her treatment at the Whitmore house was stark and revealing. When the planning was finally complete, and the leaders began to disperse to prepare their people, Chief Gray Bear approached Sarah privately. "You have done a great service for our people today," he said solemnly, "but I fear you have also made yourself an enemy of your own kind. What will you do when this is over?" Sarah had been trying not to think about that question, but she could no longer avoid it. Her old life was over. There was no returning to the Whitmores after this. She had no money, no family, nowhere to go. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Chief Gray Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Joseph Crowfeather is a man of honor. When he recovers from his wounds, he will remember his debt to you, and our people do not forget those who have shown us kindness in dark times." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the chief had moved away to speak with his warriors. She was left alone with her thoughts as the camp transformed around her. Families quietly packing their most precious possessions and preparing for a night that would determine their fate. As she watched the careful, efficient preparations, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the consequences of her choices, she knew she had done the right thing. For the first time in her life, she had acted not from obligation or fear, but from conviction. The woman who had started this journey as a humble servant was discovering reserves of courage and purpose she had never known she possessed. As the Choctaw families worked through the night to save themselves and their loved ones, Sarah McKenna began to understand that her true life was just beginning. Dawn came gray and cold, with mist rising from the stream that bordered the Choctaw camp. To any observer watching from the surrounding hills, the encampment would have appeared exactly as expected. Families gathered around cooking fires, preparing for another day of their forced journey westward. But Sarah, hidden with the other non-combatants in a rocky outcropping half a mile away, knew the truth. The figures moving through the camp were all warriors, their weapons concealed but ready. The real families, the women, children, and elders, had been spirited away in the darkness to safety. Chief Gray Bear had positioned his fighters with the skill of a seasoned military commander. Some crouched behind supply wagons, others lay concealed in shallow trenches they had dug during the night. A few had climbed into the trees that surrounded the camp, ready to rain arrows down on any attackers. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the tree line through the dim morning light. Somewhere out there, the men who had wounded Joseph and David were preparing to murder an entire community. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. If her warning proved false, if she had caused these people to abandon their journey for nothing, the consequences would be severe. The attack came just as Joseph had predicted with the first full light of sunrise. Sarah saw the muzzle flashes before she heard the gunshots. Bright sparks of flame erupting from the forest as the attackers opened fire on what they believed to be a defenseless camp. But instead of screams and chaos, the gunfire was met with an immediate and coordinated response. Choctaw warriors rose from their hiding places like spirits materializing from the earth itself, their war cries echoing across the valley as they returned fire with rifles they had kept hidden from government officials. The battle was brief, but intense. The attackers, expecting easy victims, found themselves facing experienced fighters who knew the terrain and had chosen their positions carefully. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the carefully planned ambush turned into a rout, with the surviving attackers fleeing back into the forest in disarray. When the gunfire finally stopped, Sarah could see Chief Graybear's warriors moving through the camp, checking on their positions and tending to the few who had been wounded in the exchange. The victory had come at a remarkably low cost. No Choctaw lives lost, and only 3 men with minor injuries from bullet grazes. "It is finished," said Standing Wolf, the scarred warrior who had been assigned to guard the non-combatants. "The cowards have learned that the Choctaw are not the helpless victims they believed us to be." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her as the adrenaline of the morning began to fade. She had done it. Her warning had saved lives and turned certain massacre into decisive victory. But even as she celebrated this success, she knew that larger challenges lay ahead. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the trail leading into their hiding place. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the 2 riders making their way carefully through the rocky terrain. Joseph sat tall in the saddle despite the bandage still wrapped around his head, while David rode beside him with his arm in a proper sling but his eyes bright and alert. "You came," Sarah said simply as Joseph dismounted near her position. "Did you think we would not?" Joseph's dark eyes searched her face as if looking for signs of injury or distress. "When we heard the gunfire from our hiding place, we feared we might be too late." "Your warning saved many lives today," David added in his careful English, his voice warm with gratitude and something deeper that made Sarah's cheeks flush with unexpected warmth. Chief Graybear approached their group, his weathered face creased with satisfaction at the morning's outcome. "Joseph Crowfeather, your instincts about this woman were correct. She has proven herself a true friend to our people." Joseph nodded solemnly. "Sarah McKenna has shown courage that would honor any warrior. She has earned a place among us if she chooses to claim it." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Sarah's heart race. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, Choctaw warriors and leaders who had accepted her completely, who valued her contributions and trusted her judgment. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked quietly. "It means you no longer need to live as a servant in the white man's world," Chief Graybear replied. "Our people are traveling west to new lands. You could travel with us as one of our own." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as the magnitude of the offer sank in. These people were offering her not just refuge but belonging, something she had been searching for since her parents' death without even realizing it. "But I'm not Choctaw," she protested weakly. "Your government, my government, they would never accept such an arrangement." "Governments make many laws," Joseph said with a slight smile, "but they cannot govern the human heart or choose who we claim as family." "The choice is yours, Sarah McKenna," Chief Graybear added. "But know that if you come with us, you will face hardships. The journey west is long and dangerous. The new territory will be raw and wild. Life will not be easy." Sarah thought about the alternative, returning to a world where she would always be viewed with suspicion for her actions today, where her choices would be limited to serving other people's needs and wants. She thought about the Whitmore house with its rigid expectations and casual cruelties. Then she looked at David, whose dark eyes were watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle with awareness. She thought about the conversations she had shared with Joseph, the respect these people had shown for her opinions and abilities. "If I came with you," she said slowly, "what would my place be among your people?" "Whatever place you choose to make for yourself," Joseph replied. "Teacher, healer, warrior, mother, our women are valued for their strength and wisdom, not just their ability to serve others. The concept was so foreign to Sarah's experience that she could barely comprehend it. A life where her value wasn't determined by how well she anticipated other people's needs, where she could make choices based on her own desires and convictions. "There is something else you should know," David said quietly, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "In our culture, when a woman saves a warrior's life, it creates a bond between them. A debt that can only be repaid through protection and devotion." Sarah's breath caught as she understood the implications of his words. "David, I am saying this poorly," he continued, his cheeks darkening with embarrassment. "What I mean is, if you choose to come with us, you would not be alone. There are those among us who would be honored to have you as part of their family." Joseph clapped his nephew on the shoulder with obvious approval. "David speaks truth, though he lacks the poetry to say it well. You have won the respect of our people, Sarah McKenna. You have also won something more precious from at least one young warrior." Sarah felt her world spinning as she processed this unexpected revelation. In the space of 3 days, she had gone from being a lonely servant girl to being offered not just a home, but love and partnership with people who valued her for exactly who she was. "I need time to think," she said finally, though her heart was already pulling her toward an answer. "Of course," Chief Greybear said kindly. "We will not begin our journey for another 2 days while we reorganize after this morning's events. Take the time you need to consider your choice." As the group dispersed to return to the main camp, David lingered beside Sarah for a moment longer. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "know that you have given me back my life twice over. Once when you healed my body and again when you saved my people. That is a debt I will spend my lifetime trying to repay." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah alone with thoughts that tumbled through her mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. The choice before her would determine not just where she lived, but who she would become. For the first time in her life, Sarah McKenna held her own destiny in her hands. Sarah spent the next day walking alone through the forest, her mind churning with the weight of the decision before her. Every path she had known, every certainty she had clung to, had been stripped away in the course of a few extraordinary days. The woman who had risen before dawn 3 mornings ago to gather herbs was gone, replaced by someone she was only beginning to understand. She found herself at the old trapper's cabin as the sun reached its zenith, drawn back to the place where her life had truly begun to change. The rough walls and simple furnishings looked exactly the same, but Sarah felt like she was seeing them through different eyes that had witnessed courage and kindness, that had seen a different way of living in the world. Sitting on the wooden stool where she had first tended Joseph's wounds, Sarah forced herself to consider her options with ruthless honesty. If she returned to the white settlements, her life would be forever marked by her actions. Word would spread about the servant girl who had warned the Indians, who had helped them turn the tables on their attackers. She would find no welcome at the Whitmore house or anywhere else in Arkansas territory. Even if she could somehow find another position, another family willing to employ her despite her reputation, she would always be watched with suspicion. The independence and respect she had tasted among the Choctaw would become nothing more than a memory, a brief glimpse of what might have been. But choosing to go west with the Choctaw meant leaving behind everything familiar, venturing into unknown territory with people whose customs she barely understood. It meant accepting a complete transformation of her identity, becoming something entirely new. As Sarah wrestled with these thoughts, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. She looked up to see David walking toward her, moving carefully to avoid jarring his healing shoulder. "I hope I do not intrude," he said formally, though his eyes were warm with affection. "Joseph said you might be here." "You're welcome," Sarah replied, gesturing for him to sit on the edge of the nearby bunk. "How did you know I would need time to think?" David smiled, and Sarah was struck again by how the expression transformed his serious features. "Because you are wise enough to understand the weight of such a choice. Only a fool would decide such a thing quickly." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. Finally, David spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "May I tell you about our new home, the place where our people will build their lives again?" Sarah nodded, curious to hear about this unknown territory that might become her future. "It is a land of wide skies and rolling hills," David began, his eyes growing distant as he described what he had learned from other tribes who had made the journey earlier. "There are rivers full of fish, forests rich with game, soil that will grow the corn and beans and squash that feed our people. It will not be easy to build new lives there, but it can be done. And your people? How will they accept someone like me? David's expression grew more serious. There will be some who question your presence at first. Change is always difficult, and our people have suffered much at the hands of whites, but they have also seen your courage, your willingness to risk everything to protect us. Actions speak louder than blood or skin color among the Choctaw. Sarah felt a flutter of hope at his words, followed immediately by a surge of fear. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I can't adapt to your ways? Or if I cause problems for your people? What if you find happiness and purpose you never imagined possible? David countered gently. What if you discover that home is not a place but the people who value you for who you truly are? Before Sarah could respond, they heard more footsteps approaching the cabin. This time it was Joseph who appeared, his head wound now reduced to a thin red line across his forehead. Forgive the interruption, he said, settling himself against the cabin's doorframe. But there is news you should hear before you make your decision. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. What kind of news? Riders came to our camp this morning from the direction of the white settlements. Word has spread about yesterday's battle and about the woman who warned us of the attack. Joseph's expression was grave. There are men gathering, Sarah. Men who believe you have betrayed your own kind and should be punished for it. David's hand clenched into a fist at his side. How many men? Enough to be dangerous, and they are not the type to be concerned with legal niceties or fair trials. Joseph's eyes met Sarah's. Your old life is truly finished now. The only question is what new life you will choose to build. Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her as the last of her uncertainty evaporated. The choice had been made for her in a way, or rather the consequences of her actions had revealed what the choice should be. When do your people leave for the West? She asked quietly. Joseph's stern expression broke into a smile. Tomorrow at sunrise. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I'm saying that I've never felt more at home anywhere than I have among your people these past few days. I'm saying that whatever challenges await us in the new territory, I would rather face them with you than face the alternative alone. David's face lit up with joy so pure and bright that Sarah felt her heart skip in response. Without thinking, she reached out to take his hand, and the warmth of his fingers closing around hers felt like the most natural thing in the world. There is one more thing, Joseph said, his tone becoming formal and ceremonial. Among our people, when a woman chooses to join a new clan, to leave her old life behind completely, there is a ritual. A way of marking the transformation and welcoming her into her new identity. Sarah felt a thrill of nervousness and anticipation. What kind of ritual? You would be given a new name, one that reflects your place among us and the qualities you have shown. You would be adopted formally into the Crowfeather clan, with all the rights and protections that brings. And Joseph glanced meaningfully at his nephew. If you choose, you could begin the process of joining your life to another's according to our customs. Sarah's cheeks flushed as she understood his meaning, but she found she wasn't embarrassed by the suggestion. The idea of building a life with David, of facing the future as partners rather than alone, filled her with warmth and excitement rather than fear. What would my new name be? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph considered for a moment, his eyes studying her face thoughtfully. Running Deer, he said finally, for one who moves swiftly and fearlessly through dangerous territory to help those in need. Running Deer, Sarah repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables on her tongue. The name felt right somehow, like putting on clothes that fit perfectly after years of wearing garments too large or too small. David squeezed her hand gently. Will you accept it? Will you let us welcome you home? Sarah looked around the simple cabin where her transformation had begun, then at the two men who had become her protectors and friends. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the Choctaw camp preparing for their journey to a new land and a new life. For so many years, she had survived by making herself small, by anticipating other people's needs and suppressing her own desires. But these people were offering her something entirely different, the chance to be valued for her strength rather than her submission, to be cherished for her courage rather than her compliance. Yes, she said simply, and the words seemed to echo with the weight of destiny. I accept. As the sun set on her last day as Sarah McKenna, the humble servant girl began to prepare for her new life as Running Deer. daughter of the Crowfeather clan and future wife to a brave young warrior who had vowed that no man would ever claim her against her will again. The woman who had started this journey alone and afraid was ending it surrounded by family, heading toward a future bright with possibility and love. And as David helped her to her feet and Joseph began to speak of the ceremonies that would mark her transformation, Running Deer knew that she had finally found the place where she belonged.